Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the publisher of TNSR. And if you're a regular Horns listener, you know I'm not the regular host. But I'm actually just introducing this episode, which is the first of two. It's a special two-parter honoring the legacy of Bob Jervis, the late and great scholar who recently passed away after an important career and a long, fulfilling life that enriched us all. In this episode, Frank Gavin, the director of the Kissinger Center at Johns Hopkins SAIS, moderates a conversation with Colin Kahl, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Mira Rapp-Hooper, a staffer on the National Security Council, and Derek Chollet, counselor to the Secretary of State. All knew Bob very well, all four of them. I got to know Bob later on in his life, in the last several years of his life, and was constantly impressed by what a humble, wonderful, and kind-spirited man he was, in addition to having a towering intellect. And I was very privileged to listen in on this conversation between four old friends, students, colleagues, mentees of Bob, as they talked about what he contributed to us all.
Bob Jervis was an intellectual giant, the most important scholar of international relations of his generation. The books he produced were extraordinary. Logic of Images, Perception and Misperception, System Effects, The Nuclear Revolution, countless important insights on issues ranging from intelligence to signaling to IR theory. He was also an honorary diplomatic historian. Bob read more primary documents than pretty much anyone I know. Now, the scholarly legacy is well known and has been celebrated by his many students. But Bob had another legacy, arguably as important, that we are here to discuss today. It was his influence on American foreign and national security policy. And not just his ideas, but his students. My best guess is that Bob sent more of his students to the U.S. government than anyone. And today we will discuss Bob's legacy with three of his all-star students from different generations, each of whom is an outstanding scholar in their own right, and are now serving in important positions in the Biden administration. I thought we'd start off with just asking you to tell us how you came to know Bob, your first interaction with Bob, and then maybe a story or two about what it was like to be a graduate student with him.
The honest truth is that I came to know Bob because I decided to go to Columbia because of Bob. I had come to know him through his work as an undergraduate and found myself particularly enamored of one article that he had written, which is not at all kind of one of the standout pieces of his canon that folks normally refer to when they think about him. I had read all of the sort of Jervis classics at Stanford as an undergraduate, but was particularly taken in towards the end of my time by a piece that he wrote that later became part of his book, Why Intelligence Fails. And it was a really, I think, brave and in many ways counterintuitive journal article in which he argued that intelligence in the lead up to the Iraq War had not, in fact, been politicized, but that a whole series of individual level biases, bureaucratic complexities and perversions, and a number of other outcomes had resulted in the intelligence simply being incorrect. And I found this particular article so exciting because I found it really persuasive, even though it completely ran counter to what I believed at the time, and I suspected ran counter to what he believed. So I really sought him out as an advisor, and I made my decision about where to become a graduate student because of Bob. And needless to say, he did not disappoint. I think one of the things that we'll uncover over the course of this conversation, as many others have as they've written about him, is the fact that he was not just an intellectual giant. He was one of the most fun people in the world to spend time with. You know, whether it was, as we were just discussing before we got started, his capsule wardrobe that he pioneered of khakis, of Lacoste polo shirts and turtlenecks in the winter, the sort of mischievous glint in his eye and devilish sense of humor, or his tendency to climb on his own desk to reach books off the top shelf to hand to his students. It really was a treat to be in his orbit and to study under him.
That's a great story. And one thing that I think you highlighted that's really important is Bob had all these little hidden jewels of articles. Like there's sometimes the obvious piece everyone knows, cooperation of the security dilemma, but he had all these great little pieces that held there were just gold nuggets in it that were extraordinary.
Or sometimes they were works in progress, conference papers or things
True.
that, he would find at the upper shelf, in some pile of paper, when you would mention something, and it would spark a memory of his, and he would somehow in this, rabbit's den of an office, with just like stuff everywhere, be able to find that one article.
It's interesting that both Derek and Mira have made reference to his appearance in his office, and I think I think there's a reason for that, which was, Bob Jervis was kind of an odd-looking guy. I mean, he looked like a recluse,
kind of like a Merlin.
Yeah,
in a way, right?
He had this mustache and this kind of chin beard, and
I believe it's called a goatee.
he kind of looked like a hermit. His office was wall-to-wall books. Every wall was completely a bookcase. It was overflowing, but there was also the horizontal stack of volumes and yellowing manuscripts, and his desk was like at the oddest of angles.
It was like at a weird angle.
It made no sense. It was kind of in the center of the room.
His computer was right by the door.
And
and also from 1972.
Totally.
Correct. And he was hunched over it, and he would peck. And I don't know if it was 2 fingers or 3 fingers. It definitely wasn't all the fingers. And you would, just his appearance, and he only had essentially 2 outfits: the khaki pants with the red turtleneck, or the khaki pants with the red polo shirt. And it was seasonal.
Which I am wearing the red polo shirt.
Derek is
in memoriam.
In his
memoriam.
So like you would think, just kind of based on the office and his appearance, they would be this kind of recluse, except that when you went up to the 13th floor of the International Affairs Building into the Institute of War and Peace Studies, where his office door was always open. And you would, and when you were initially a graduate student, when you first arrived, you'd be really nervous to engage or whatever. But if you went up and you kind of shyly knocked on the open door, he would always turn around, and it was clear that you had kind of interrupted him in the middle of some big thought. But he never acted perturbed by that. He was like quick to engage, and he is probably the smartest person, but least arrogant intellectual I ever encountered, because he spent about 80% of any given conversation asking you questions. And through the questions, you could tell where he was nudging the conversation. But I just thought, like, the degree to which he would embrace not just kind of fellow titans of the field, but new graduate students, and really just want to engage with them intellectually was, I think, extraordinary.
So you've highlighted, I think, 2 things that really there's many things that made Bob unique. One is nobody read more than him. Like, I don't know how he read as much as he did.
And read more widely.
Read widely. He would sit and read Frus volume. But the other is your point about his generosity. And maybe you could share a story involving one of those 2.
I met him actually through the policy world in a way. 30 years ago this summer, I was an intern on the policy planning staff at the State Department, and the director of policy planning was Dennis Ross, who was a student of Bob's at UCLA back in the late 70s, early 80s, and had also followed a unorthodox path from in sort of scholarship as well, then into the policy world. Of course, Dennis went on, after being director of policy planning for James Baker, to be the chief Middle East envoy through the 90s, and then came back into the Obama administration. And Dennis was very close with Bob. And of course, I had read his stuff as an undergrad, but I had probably the more traditional gateway into the Jervis canon, Hypotheses on Misperception, which was I read in some edited volume during IR 101 class at Cornell. So I liked Bob's work, but because of my experience with Dennis Ross, I had sought him out, and that's why I had applied to Columbia. So the first time I met him was probably 94 or so, but then I didn't start at Columbia until 95. And I think in addition to the day-to-day generosity that Collins mentioned, in terms of his door was always open every time you walked in, even though I too was a little nervous when I first walked in there, that he, would give you that article or a citation or something to follow up on if you had an idea. He would help you take it one step further. Was that when I also wanted to chart a different path in terms of, I had decided I wasn't going to be an academic. I used to, joke with him that I was kind of the wayward child of his family, and that, I never finished my PhD. I, decided I wanted to write books, for commercial press and serve in government, but he was always incredibly supportive of me. And particularly during those years at Columbia when I was kind of, on the fence of where I was going to go, he never gave me the guilt trip, or, he didn't believe that his way was the only way. In some ways, that's reflective of his view on the world and on scholarship. He's incredibly open-minded. He, drew from so many different fields in his work, and that only grew over time. And of course, his landmark work early on was bringing in psychology into the study of international relations. And that's the last thing I'll say, just as an opener. What always attracted to me about Bob, and I think one of the reasons why he was so impactful on policy, is he actually really cared and thought a lot about people. And he wanted to understand why decision makers made the decision they did, whether they were good decisions or bad decisions. He wanted to get to the root of that. And he understood that the root of that, we all serve, it's a larger system, and, whether it's the international system or a domestic system, but he was very, very interested in people and the decisions they made. And that's what always attracted me to him, because any of us who have served in the policy world understand how important people are, and our beliefs are, and the way our minds work are, and the way that interacts with these larger forces, I think is the key to understanding international politics.
So that's a great insight. And I want to bring this conversation into talking about Bob's role in engaging policy. But Mira, you had a great story that you were telling us earlier that I think captures all of this, the generosity of spirit and the sort of desire to sort of see people flourish in the world. Perhaps you could share that with us?
Absolutely. I think it resonates with a lot of what Derek just shared. As I have already mentioned, I literally chose Columbia because of Bob. And I felt extraordinarily lucky to be his student and to be mentored by him for the 5 years that I was there. But I had gone to graduate school knowing that there was a good chance that I was not going to become a tenure-tracked political scientist, and that I might wish instead to do something that was more policy-facing in my day-to-day. And there was a period of time in which I sort of, questioned that, and maybe was leaning a little bit more towards really staying in the field. But by the time I had my dissertation underway, I knew that I had different plans for myself than many of my fellow Columbia graduate students did. By the time I was a fourth year, I think I had started already to rehearse in my head the conversation in which I told Bob that I was not going on the academic job market at all. But I did not share that information with him because, on the advice of sort of fellow students, I wanted to make sure that he took me seriously and that he didn't let up in his mentorship of me and his support of me because of any career choice that I might make down the line. And I remember so distinctly as I, got my first job here in Washington at CSIS, realized I was going to take it, that I started immediately rehearsing that conversation in the mirror because I was so nervous to tell him that I needed to speed up my dissertation defense because I was staying in Washington and I wasn't going on the market. And the day finally came where I sat down in his office, and I think he could tell I was so nervous, and he must have been near certain what I was about to tell him. And rather than be the least bit surprised or disappointed, the first thing I detected in him was just this extraordinary empathy, kind of wide eyes and nodding head, that he was trying to reassure me that the thing I was sort of stammering to get out was completely okay to say. And I, shared the news with him that I had accepted a job, that I was really excited about it, I wanted to defend in the next few months, and that I did not intend to go on the academic market. And then, in my anxiety, I apologized. And he stopped me and he said, "This is not an occasion for an apology. This is an occasion for congratulations. I know who you are. And more importantly, you know who you are. And I will ask two things of you at this stage. The first is that you keep researching and writing, and ideally publishing books. And the second is that every time you come back to see me at Columbia, you bring 3 pieces of original gossip from Washington." And by original, I mean that if I have already heard them from Colin or from Derek, then they don't count. And of course, that conversation kind of set us on the tone that would be our relationship and our friendship for the rest of his life. We got closer, not farther away, as I ventured into this world. And not only did I never feel the slightest bit of disappointment from him in my career choices, I felt tremendous pride and interest in what I was doing. And thinking back on that moment and the sort of body language he was using, the kind words that he said to kind of usher me into my own decision really encapsulates who he was to so many of us.
I almost think there was a self-interest. It was probably unacknowledged, but when I was a graduate student, I didn't realize how often Bob Jervis went to Washington.
Right.
It was just not part of his identity that I saw.
Because he didn't really brag about it.
Correct.
It wasn't,
Correct. In fact, he didn't really brag about anything, which for someone who is arguably the most influential, international relations scholar of his generation, it's not typical to be as self-effacing as he was or humble as he was. But I think what I realized once I did do the standard academic track, but I've spent about half of my life as an academic in government in one capacity or the other. And, Bob would just come visit, and it didn't matter what position I was in. He would typically come down. He had, he was on a number of advisory boards, but he did a lot of stuff that he really never talked about, where he would go and essentially read documents for the CIA and provide kind of a historical or intellectual analytic perspective on things, things like the Iranian Revolution and Iraq WMD and a whole bunch of these things. Mira's already made reference to some of his writings on intelligence failures. But every time he would come down, he would always budget an extra day or two, and it would just be to make the rounds. So it would go to see Derek or Dennis Ross or Victor Cha or Mira or me or Tom Christensen when he was in Washington. Some people working for Republican administrations, some people working for Democratic administrations. And the thing that always struck me in this Mira's point about gossip, I always thought that there was a piece of this where for Bob it was research. Like he would come down and he, unlike a lot of smarty pants academics, he didn't come down and kind of say, here's all the things you guys are doing wrong. Instead, he wanted to interrogate kind of how we were thinking about things, how we had come to certain decisions, why it was, had we considered this or that or the other thing, but never from a kind of position of judgment, but from a position of inquiry. Right.
It was never a sense I was feeling defensive with him and that I was trying to explain, how we had screwed something up, although there was plenty of that. But it was never he was genuinely curious about what was going on and how we were reaching the decisions we were and what we were thinking about.
Which actually highlights an interesting puzzle. One of the things when, I remember when I did the interview with him a couple of years ago, talking about his early life. Here's a guy who grew up in a very far left household, who was at Berkeley at the height of the free speech movement, who was very much against the Vietnam War. And if you were to kind of put this kind of background into, predict what would happen, you would have actually not predicted any of this. And I think this is one of the interesting puzzles. And I wonder, you've all kind of hinted at this, but what is it that led somebody who was clearly, given his temperament and his background and his upbringing and his intellectual training, had some skepticism about power and policy, but who was also both so engaged in it and devoted to it? Which, is there a tension or is there not a tension there? How do you think about that?
I think a lot of it was, at the heart of all of his theoretical work is this acknowledgement that human beings walk through life making theory-laden decisions, and that none of those theories are absolutely right or absolutely wrong in all circumstances, but that doesn't detract from the fact that they are extraordinarily impactful on the decisions that people make. So the world is extraordinarily complex. None of us can process it holistically or comprehensively. We all have to use shortcuts. It's why, Perception and Misperception in International Politics was such a standout book at the time and remains a classic, because it not only put human beings at the center of the study of international politics, but specifically tapped into this vast reservoir of kind of cognitive and social psychology to ask basic questions about how people filter and interpret information and how that guides their decisions. And I suspect that Bob was suspicious of anybody who believed that they had it all figured out. They had all figured out,
right,
because he knew too much about history and knew too many examples of people who thought they had it all figured out, and it was just a particular perspective, and sometimes it was perspective that took them in horribly wrong and tragic directions.
Yeah. So that's a great, because the other thing I was going to ask you guys is you look at his profile, it's in a field of international relations where you guys all know the Isaiah Berlin, Leo Tolstoy, hedgehog versus foxes. And it's the hedgehogs that are often rewarded for exactly what Colin said, the big theory that explained everything.
Right.
And Bob was the ultimate fox.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, I guess one of the things I'm trying to understand is how, I mean, I used to kid Bob that he wasn't really an international relations professor. He seems so out of step with him. I mean, how do you think about him and his connection to sort of the intellectual disciplines you were all trained in? Because you all made these particular choices to work with him, but it's also, you've all described an experience that's much different than, say, working with other international relations professors. Have you reflected upon that, or what are your...
Well, I mean, what's interesting and I think very unusual about him is he just had a boundless curiosity. And this maybe gets back to what Colin was saying about, he knows that at the root of all this, there are humans stumbling their way through the world. And he in many ways personified that as an academic. I mean, I used to think that sometimes his books, like Perception and Misperception, is like a long walk where he makes hundreds, if not thousands, of very, very interesting observations. And I mean, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of dissertations or books that have been written based on just a paragraph or a couple sentences of that book. And that's really the way he approached his scholarship and his life. I mean, part of the experience we all had of him finding some random article on the top shelf of his office, often from an obscure journal or magazine article or something, is that he was very sort of non-judgmental about where things were coming from, and he was open to so much. And so that, I mean, particularly, I know, Frank, a book that you think is his best or his most interesting, System Effects, which was probably too cutting edge in many ways for academia, because it brought in so many fields that certainly traditional international relations theorists were uncomfortable with, biology and evolution and all this kind of stuff. So
he also pulled off a trick that nobody else could have pulled off. And it goes to this point about being so widely read but that also people understood that he actually read all those books and all those articles and all those disciplines, because he was theoretical, but he was also deeply empirical, but not in a traditional way.
Right.
Like, a normal IR empiricist writes chapters that dive deeply into particular historical moments or periods or case studies or whatever. Bob didn't do that.
Right.
He would instead, he would throw out 1,000 ideas and give you 2, 3, 4 illustrative examples.
Exactly.
And I think for most other people, they wouldn't be able to get away with it, actually,
right.
because you would say, well, it's too thin. There's no deep empirics there. But people, he had credibility.
Right. And I was thinking, could Perception and Misperception be written today? Probably not.
No, I think almost absolutely not.
Yeah.
I think a lot of his work could not be done today.
Yeah.
And, back to Frank's point, sort of how do you reconcile him and the way he thought with our field in general? He was a theorist, right? Everything, all of his kind of high-level observations, whether it's perception or misperception or system effects, it is theory-laden, and then it is empirically driven, but the empirics are kind of a litany of anecdotal evidence or of observation. And it sort of breaks the mold of what we think of as traditional IR theory today. But if you knew him, then you had the privilege of knowing that the way that he wrote was much like the way that he spoke. It was the way that his mind worked. In some ways, I think describing it as a long walk is almost too linear. I always think of it as more kind of labyrinthine. Yeah. And when you went into a conversation with him, if you went to visit his office, you would kind of lose track of time and feel like you were falling down a rabbit hole. And sometimes pull back and not even be exactly sure what you thought now, because the series of questions that he asked you and references that he gave you had complexified things so much more than they simplified anything. And in that way, he was the exact opposite of the kind of prevailing minds in the field, at least when I came up, which was to say that he kind of lived to make things more intricate, more complex, more problematized. And that was what made him great.
That's a great description. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, what you're describing here is a sort of a Jervisian temperament, which you've all really eloquently laid out. But it's also clear that he was unique. And so I guess the question I'm wondering is why this way of viewing the world, which had such a tremendous influence on scholarship and has had such an obvious influence on policy, particularly in the people serving, why hasn't this become more widespread? Is it just that Bob was a unique figure that couldn't be replicated? He certainly has students in the academy, and some of them are doing excellent work. But why, when we think about the field of international relations, this, what you've all really described so nicely, is not what I think the most prevalent way of pursuing research, scholarship, training. And I wonder why that is, because it seems unfortunate. Have you guys thought about that at all?
I mean, I think it goes back to your fox and hedgehog point a little bit. I mean, I think in academia, you're encouraged to specialize. And I also think that that specialization happens in both the theoretical and in the empirical domains. So I think theoretically, I think people tend to, very early in their academic careers kind of create an identity that puts them in a certain camp. And I think, Bob would be the first to say that essentially once you've clinged on to that, it's, you don't want to let it go. And so it's the rare person like Bob actually that wasn't in one camp, but kind of slalomed through a course of many camps. I mean, I think in some ways at root bottom, there were certain aspects of Bob where he was a realist. I think that he believed that the world was an anarchic and competitive world where, states and their constituent elements compete for power and security. But for him, that was the mere starting point for a whole host of questions about interaction effects, which is what the systems effects is about the role of technology and geography, which is, when he talked about the nuclear revolution or certain aspects of the offense-defense balance, or human psychology as it relates to perception and misperception, or certain logics of images, that you just the kind of that realist baseline just didn't take you very far,
right?
And it was a starting point, but not an ending point. And then he was just willing to draw on, it could be natural science, it could be chaos theory, it could be game theory, it could be diplomatic history, and frankly, he just read more. He spent more of his time reading more widely than any. And I don't know that you could have any incentive structure for someone who was that wide open theoretically and was allowed to kind of be this rock skipping across the history of the world.
Right.
And in your writing, there's just no incentive structure for that.
Right. And Colin, the point you made earlier about his suspicion of people who thought they had figured it all out, he definitely never thought he had figured it all out, which explains his curiosity and his willingness to draw on so many different disciplines to try to understand decisions and understand the world. Look, we all came of age in the 90s and 2000s where the field was certainly, driving more and more towards ever more simple solutions or explanations for things and deducing things down to their core essence, which for me just oversimplified things and made it less relevant and reflective of life as I understood it, and certainly policymaking as I understood it. And the closer I got to policymaking, the less I saw the relevance to that some of the academic work that was dominating the field of international relations was to day-to-day problems that policymakers face. And I think, it's interesting, probably the area where Bob had the most impact in policymaking is one that we are consumers of, but we're not part of, which is the intelligence community. And there, it's not just senior intelligence officials; it's all down the ranks of intelligence analysts who are very familiar with his work. Not just the postmortems and the work he did on Iran or on Iraq, but also just particularly from perception and misperception, the way that he explained biases and the work that he's done, I think, has really had a direct impact on the IC.
No, I was really just going to drive home what Derek said at the beginning of his comment, which is to say that part of Bob's humility was that, not only was he not persuaded of his own fundamental correctness, he was actually driven to constantly question even his own work. And that is sort of how we get to the body of work that he produced. Quite in contrast to, eminent scholars who put forth very parsimonious theories and then defend them to the hilt. He was constantly open and willing to look for evidence that undermined previous assertions of his own. And when colleagues or former students actually produced work that really flew in the face of some of his prior work, he welcomed it as part of the process that everyone was engaged in together.
That's a great point. There's one quality that you guys have hinted at, but I think is really missing in today's landscape. And he was an expert. He had no problem admitting he was wrong or being wrong or actually encouraging people to find out he's wrong. I remember first substantive conversation I ever had with him was after he wrote this piece in Journal of Cold War Studies. Again, just like your idea of a little piece that nobody would have ever thought of, that basically said, was the Cold War security dilemma? And he said, no. And I went to him, I said, you don't actually believe in the security dilemma, do you? And he got that twinkle in his eye that we all know about and that smile. And it began like a 7-hour conversation. And the interesting question there is that just that ability to embrace people critiquing your work and having the confidence and the curiosity to accept that? Is that just something, is that just unique to Bob Jervis? Is it something we can recapture? Is it something that you've all tried to, because it seems to be another part of his extraordinary legacy.
Yeah, I don't know if it's unique. It's definitely rare. I will say this about, and it goes to some points that Mira and Derek raised as well. We were all trained as IR scholars. But, when you go into the policy world, you read a lot of IR stuff and you don't actually recognize the world that you experience in what you read. That's not the case with Bob Jervis's work. I think the interesting thing about Bob Jervis's work is that he was first and foremost an IR theorist. His work is deeply empirically informed, again, in this kind of anecdotal storytelling way, and actually a lot of his writings are not driven by a particular policy question, and he doesn't have like the section at the end that says, here are the 7 things policymakers will do. But you read a Jervis piece, and if you've served in government in the national security apparatus, you recognize the world that he describes in a way that is very rare of a political scientist. Maybe more common reading history or other disciplines, but not in political science. And I will say this, the idea that there is rarely a conversation on the really big national security questions that I've encountered in the Situation Room in the Obama administration, the Biden administration, that doesn't boil down to some debate among the people around the table about whether this is fundamentally a question of the spiral model or the deterrence model.
Absolutely.
People are familiar with the security dilemma that essentially international politics is driven by states seeking security, but the actions that one state takes to arrive at security makes the other insecure, and so you get in this feedback loop of insecurity, arms racing, competition, and so conflict is largely driven by tragedy. That's the spiral model. The deterrence model is actually, no, conflict is driven by hard conflicts of interest, greed, ambition, revisionist actors, imperialist aims, those types of situations. And the spiral model or the security dilemma inclines you to seek for ways to accommodate the adversary, to engage the adversary, to search for face-saving ways out and exit ramps. The deterrence model says, no, you do all of those things, and it actually emboldens the adversary to push further, and it will encourage more aggression. And the way that an IR theorist, a typical IR theorist would say is, one is either right, one is right and when the other is wrong. That is, one is a description of the underlying laws, the iron laws of international politics, and the other is just incorrect. Bob actually didn't approach it that way. If you read Perception and Misperception, his argument is that there are instances of both the spiral model and the deterrence model, and that some of it is about the nature of a particular actor. Do they embrace the status quo? Do they embrace revisionism? But part of it is, how do actors perceive their adversaries? And do they believe that they're in one model or the other? And so, my experience is when you're having debates about, why China is doing X, Y, and Z in the South China Sea, or why Putin is doing this, that, or the other thing as it relates to Ukraine or other former Soviet republics, that whether people recognize it or not, almost everybody around the table is having some type of debate about, really, are we in a situation of the spiral model where insecurity is driving what the adversary is doing, or are we in a deterrence model where the other side is a revisionist actor that if we don't push back against them, we'll eat our lunch?
Right. And I feel exactly the same way. And I find myself constantly reflecting back on many of the observations he made in Perception and Misperception or others about ways that our shortcuts to rationality create biases or flaws, everything from overestimating our impact on someone else's decision-making to assuming that the adversary is making a decision that's well-considered and purposeful, whereas what we're doing is completely innocent, and they should clearly understand that our process is not nearly as well put together or well considered as theirs. To the idea that we all have motivated bias, and we all, whether it's wishful thinking or this idea that we make a decision and we want to ensure that to think that it's working. There are, or also an observation to me, a very simple one once, that political leaders have a lot of confidence in their own decision-making ability because they became political leaders. If you were elected president of the United States, you think that you figured out politics pretty well. And that can create biases in your own decision-making. So there's constant sort of lessons that he's taught throughout his work that I find myself either trying to prevent myself falling into or seeing colleagues struggling with.
So this is interesting because I was going to ask about how much in your day-to-day lives, when you're crafting and implementing policy, the spirit of Bob Jervis is there over your shoulder. Right. The reason being is, I think a lot of times when you talk in these bridging the gap programs, you talk to people who are in your sort of situation, you get the sense people have two brains, right? They actually switch, they have their academic brain, and then they go into policy, and the overlap is not that great. That, smart people can succeed at a variety of things. You could be successful at academics, and then you can go into policy, and if you're either good or bad at that, and maybe it uses a different skill set. What you're all describing actually is a far greater overlap. And I'd love to hear more about that. I'd love to hear maybe if you had an example of a time where some sort of Jervisian insight or Jervisian temperament shaped something you did. And also, just if you had any thoughts about how to capture and inculcate that generally in training the next generation, right? Because this is pretty rare. So I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on that.
On the first piece of your question, like the sort of two-brainedness when folks think about scholarship and policymaking, I think, this is my first stint in government. And one of the ideas that, I knew not to be true for some time, but I'd probably fantasized about as a graduate student, was the idea that there were just litanies of articles that came across policymakers' desks and changed the way they think, right? That almost never happens, unfortunately, right? And now sort of being in a seat, I get to see how little that happens. But one of the other things that I have been really struck by since coming into government is how often I think about Bob's work and reference Bob's work, and how little I think about other scholars' work by proportion. And that's not to diminish the work of other scholars, but it is to say that when you are in the drumbeat of the day-to-day and you need to make quick decisions under constraint in highly suboptimal situations, the grand theory is a lot less likely to have purchase for you than sort of really rich set of insights that make you question and turn over the problem that's sitting in your lap in ways that turn out to be really useful.
I think it's a really interesting point that Mira's making. I think the other kind of Jervisian perspective that actually translates a lot in the policy world is that if you start from the Jervis insight that all human beings make theory-laden decisions and have causal models for how the world works in their heads, then you actually see policy debates about what to do as fundamentally debates about how the world works. And if you twiddle this knob, it'll have this effect, and twiddle that knob, it'll have that effect. And once you surface the assumptions and try to figure out, well, if this, then that, there is a degree to which debates over options or courses of action are essentially different hypotheses based on, what we know, what we assume about the environment, what we assume about ourselves, what we assume about the adversary or the competitor. And then, therefore, if you do X, Y will happen. They're actually a series of hypotheses. Now, they are not hypotheses about events in the past. They are hypotheses about what your actions will produce in the future. So it's not exactly this. It's not exactly the same, but there are all sorts of habits of mind, intellectual habits of mind that you can learn as an academic, and especially in this kind of Jervisian way that have relevance day to day. I sometimes tell my students who ask, whether there's anything about my academic background that's relevant to the policymaking one. And the point I make is it's useful to think like an academic as long as you don't talk like an academic. But it's actually not. You shouldn't actually think like all academics. If you think about, I think that Jervis actually, his approach to things was more useful than most.
Look, I think often about his fundamental insight, and I struggle with this too, is people do not want to make trade-offs. And policymakers struggle with that every day. The idea that there could be a price that has to be paid, and we'll find all ways around to try to making a trade-off. Secondly, and I alluded to this earlier, I'm always struck that we impose on another, an adversary in particular, some kind of brilliant decision-making process that we don't have. We understand our own flaws and imperfections in our debates, but we impose on others this idea that they've got it all figured out and they're making all of these intricate decisions, and so all of their moves are finely tuned and purposeful, whereas ours are, we try, but often we see how imperfect they are. I used to joke all the time that back in the Obama administration, during Syria, when Assad would make some, the Syrians would make some move. We'd say, well, Assad's trying to signal this to us, and this is the purpose. And I'm thinking to myself, we can't even at DOD get a letter signed by the SecDef on something without 15 clearances. Like, how do we think that Assad's got that all figured out and we don't? But that also then can lead to bad decisions, because we often think that our adversaries in particular are doing something by design, and we understand we are perhaps not. And therefore we respond in a way, and they of course think we're doing it all by design. We think we're fundamentally innocent. And that's one of the basic insights he made in Perception and Misperception.
Derek and Colin have both given great examples of Bob's work in kind of potentially or manifestly adversarial situations. But his work on signaling kind of reasserts its relevance for me all the time, including in peacetime and including in relationships with allies and partners. I think the kind of key catechism that I always sort of hear him repeating in my brain is to first and foremost consider the audience. That, in international politics, there is not actually any unilateral assertion of anything. There is no kind of policy that the United States government makes that unto itself results in a self-contained outcome. But rather, what actually happens is going to be the result of the reverberations with whomever the audience or the counterparty turns out to be in that situation. So that was something that was really front of mind for me over the course of last year as my team at NSC worked on the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. We thought a lot about who we were working with in the Indo-Pacific, who would be receiving the signals that we sought to send in this document. And that sort of thought given to the audience and the set of reverberations that would go on between us and what that would ultimately mean for U.S. policy was really important to the document we ended up with.
Thank you for listening to this special episode of the Horns of a Dilemma podcast. Don't miss the second episode, which will be coming out very soon.